What am I? What are we anyways? What am I? What are we anyways? Hi there. Nice to see you all again. Oh, there's Rupinder and Laulia. Nice to see you from all the way from China. Adrian, Silas, you're back again. I'm glad you're here. I'm glad you're all here. Today we are talking about growing a body mind. Growing a body mind. The egg and sperm unite. Here we begin with nothing but flesh. The fetus is differentiating flesh without thought or idea, without any of the knowledges adults and culture will eventually create in the future individual, without will or direction, without a self, without a personal history of its own. There is no world waiting to be discovered. There is no cache of human knowledge about to be downloaded. These things, the world, things, thoughts, percepts, are co-creations of the environments and the differentiating brain, body, self. All these things, the world and self and stories about the world and the self, which are clan-generated and accepted words strung together, are about to be created ex nihilo, from nothing. We'll see that the world, and eventually the self, and all the stories we confabulate about the world and the self, are actually highly concatenated cerebral biological societal patterns. These patterns evolved over time spans of years. These patterns evolved over many hundreds of millions of years for the species. These patterns evolve over the first few years of a human individual's life. These patterns develop and evolve, more precisely, co-evolve as neural patterns in the individual. We'll see this. Concatenated is a big word. We'll see it throughout this exposition. Concatenated in these contexts mean primordially and essentially both hierarchically and laterally interrelated, constructed of and resonating in interactive, somewhat modular chunks or gestalts. Cerebral, physical, and verbal things related to parts of things that themselves have parts, all eventually attached together by differentiating words. Almost all aspects of discrimination result from the brain's fabulous ability to concatenate signals of every kind. This will be shown throughout. The beginning. The fertilized cell in the womb becomes differentiating flesh. The tiny, well-organized container and recipient and expressor of 1.5 billion years of life adaptation, 83 million years of mammalian evolution, 53 million years of primate adaptations, 2 million years of humanoid adaptations, biochemical, structural, species adaptive, genotypic, and phenotypic conformations, encoded and released mysteriously in one cell at one moment. It, this fertilized cell, brings nothing with it, owns nothing, except highly differentiated cytoplasm and its organelles and its genetic material. Its genetic material is not a thought pattern or a template or a blueprint, but a complexity of molecules interacting with a very tiny but already phenomenally intricate environment in a in a larger phenomenally intricate environment, mommy, who in turn lives in another phenomenally intricate environment, her neighborhood. Furthermore, all parts and processes of the fertilized egg interact, co-create, holographically, in concatenated domains from the atomic molecular through the placental and up to the clan, cultural, and even the geographical. Holographically means that patterns of interactions in and between domains conform each other as interference patterns that evolve. We'll see all of this. It has no words, no coherent self, no purpose or need of its own, only just beginning reflexive molecular, but unconscious body self-awareness, this fetus. It creates itself without thought, external blueprint, or will. It is an organic self-assembly, though without a self, in a phenomenally complex context. It is a world mother-baby co-creation. The baby eco-niche, ecological niche, is inside the mommy eco-niche, which is inside the local world eco-niche. Each domain interacts with, conforms, and constrains the other niches. Cascades of conformations and organic constraints oscillate back and forth, possibly holographically at times. This whole thing is not a thought process, not a concept, not a series of events. It is unbelievably complex, physical interactions of chemical, molecular, electrical being in itself. We work to understand this process through simple serial descriptions that have little to do with the process itself. The thoughtlessly differentiating flesh is dependent on the mother as environmental envelope and stimulant, and on mommy daddy for the original biochemical structural building blocks. The world, the local interactive environment, in every sense and level of the word environment, the world co-creates the evolving child tissue in constant interaction, engagement, harmonizing. A multidimensional, chemical, biological co-sculpting. Co-creates means that the flesh creates is environment, that the signal conforms so as to further facilitate signal recognition. Light stimulates the elaboration of pathways that become further able to differentiate impinging light signaling. This miracle, developed mindlessly over 1.5 billion years, and creates all extant life on our planet. influence from the far outside world, nutrition, stress, or toxins, and from the close outside world, placental health, mommy's blood health, mommy's life health, which could include drinking, depression, delight, and influences from the inside world, the fetus's complex of genetics, organizing, and beginning expression of tissue differentiation, interplay on every level. All takes place in niches of proximal interaction with interpenetrating influences of every kind. Every part of its being is made conjointly by co-orchestration and interaction of its DNA blueprint with its milieu. And the milieu makes the genes work and elaborate as much as the genes construct the tissue milieu primordially. This co-creation will be true every minute, every instant of its existence, at every level of observation, from now until it ceases to be 60, 70, 80 years later. Light patterns themselves sculpt visual pathways by use. Over time, unattached, unconnected neurons die back, while the usefully synaptically linked neurons thrive and reinforce. And as the reactive pathways become more and more expert in responding to the patterns, they slowly also bring into being recurrent and reentrant cerebral paths or nexuses. Reentrant pathways mean that complex axonal pathways linking cerebral and brainstem modules strengthen and differentiate, allowing two or more likely multi-way and multimodal influences, reverberatory excitations, that become permanently operative in parsing the stimuli and linking it coherently. Reentrant pathway elaboration and manifestation is a difficult and oft missed reality that we've only begun to understand, if we do at all. The elaboration of intra-brain patternings from brain nuclei, organelles, cortex, cerebellum, thalamus, brainstem, substantia nigra, putamen, etc., is extremely critical and signifies the nature of what the brain becomes. Intra-brain reentrant pathways means that the brain from the beginning wires itself to itself. It elaborates connections not with the outside world so much as with its own beginning primitive structures of interaction. Reentrancy is not only between allied nuclei or modular brain areas, but between many disparate areas that we have no vocabulary to explore or delineate. We don't understand this process hardly at all. The brain elaborated itself axonally, synaptically, electrochemically as a system. And the world is created out of this elaboration. Nothing else. Without the brain's self-connecting wirings, there is nothing. No world, no things, no functioning animal, no self. And it's becoming more and more apparent that the bulk of the brain's activities is with itself. We imagine the brain as essentially looking out at the world out there, waiting to see what's already outside the skull. But this is a falsity that disallows us from understanding the true nature of reality. The pathways are overwhelmingly reentrant. Multimodular, multisensory connections elaborate and complexify under the influence of myriad and complex external and internal stimulations. And the brain is also a selectional system. It co-creates itself at a tissue level under stimulation. Tissues elaborate or die, both synaptically and neuronally axonally. Tissues and tissue modules tune themselves to both the internal and external signals. If they don't connect, they die back, making way for them that do resonate. Fetal brain cells migrate and selectively differentiate, massively cross-wire, then further select themselves, creating nodes, cerebral and other nuclei, for example, that will be synaptically further molded all through the organism's existence. Pathways are reentrant. That is, they are attaching to be massively parallel, cross-modularly interconnected. We don't have a good model as to what this is really entailing or how it works in adults. Gerald Edelman, a researcher, further shows how pathways are what he calls degenerate. That is, in a way of speaking, massively redundant as to outcome. Cerebral tissue differentiates itself in a myriad of ways as needed. Tissue is tuned to do all the innumerable things cerebral CNS tissue does without a conductor or a programmer or a program. Tissue itself has myriad forms and patterns, yet creates itself in ways that accomplish what the brain must learn to do. Brain tissue is somewhat, and at times in certain areas, startlingly, adaptively, plastically connected. And it is able to represent, encode the world without having to do it in a preordained, pre-selected manner or mode. It has no program. It's important to think about this deeply. Neural tissue as tissue isn't programmed at all. The signal tunes and most literally creates the tissue and tissue structures that react more and more sensitively to the signal, a co-creation, more and more sensitively to what the organism living in its echo niches needs to survive. It is clear that I don't think we have a good model for what this really entails. It's too big for our everyday linear abstraction producing brains. It is not a textbook story. But slowly, it's very early. The first year is preparation much structure building according to the DNA blueprint, setting of first circuits, reflexes of many kinds attaching themselves together neuronally. Pathways grow to be exuberantly well connected, and the association cortex commences to elaborate itself, jointing parts of the world together. The faint promise of the mature humans discriminating more and more precise detail, though not yet. The body creates recurrent pathways exuberantly, and primitive proprioceptive maps of the body itself and its space take shape. The maps are not abstractions, but muscle behavior patterned circuit traces, synaptic loadings embedded in larger sequenced movement rhythms and sharpening reflexes of many kinds. And many systems are reentrant learned patterns that will never be changed. Many systems are reentrant learned patterns that will never be changed. This core patterning is multidimensional, multimodal, but largely invisible to the individual, and always will be. It's much deeper than the proprioceptive systems that we can feel. It has nothing to do with the sensory or cognitive systems we use to experience the world, therefore is invisible. And we scarcely have inklings about how the extraordinarily complex cadencing, millisecond timings of disparate and incommensurate input-output systems, cadencing, the body-brain develops and precisely integrates. Every system, plus all the ones we simply don't have words, vocabularies to express, every system must be near perfectly cadenced for the organism to function. She or he, our beautiful child, begins to have simple control of the limbs, trunk, head. Eye tracking pathways start to work cooperatively. Vocal cords and tongue begin the first practicings of what will be extravagantly and precisely orchestrated signaling organs. It, she, he begins simple mapping of the spatial environment through the body's meanderings. Primordial, body-based feelings, brainstem nuclei, thalamus, hippocampus, and above, integrate, regulating survival at an organismic level, and together map the physical body-brain stem to the complexifying and early myelinating associative processes. All of this is unconscious, unwilled, preordained by DNA and the patrimony of our human germline, but actuated by the environmental stimuli milieu. Every aspect of animal-human development is dependent on early stimulation and constant usage to become effectively usable. Visual, oral, both vestibular and hearing aspects, proprioceptive, cognitive, and every other complexly integrated system must be worked constantly to develop. At the deepest levels, scarcely recognized, never mind understood, completely unconsciously orchestrated processes learn to cadence visual and sound patterns and early sensory motor patternings and create myriad short-term memory circuits links that match, compare, and further link all parts of the somatocerebrospheres. Primary skills that begin to evolve are visual, oral, association region recognition of stimuli, the beginnings of object recognition, and the coherent association of consistently reappearing stimuli. A reminder you probably don't need. All advanced primates undergo the same miraculous and near infinitely complex development. Bodies integrate massively and powerfully, and for animals, most often faster than our beloved little human sweetie pies. Brainstems, cerebellums co-create magnificent competences. A baby orangutan, a baby rhesus, a young gorilla see, hear, act, and relate complexly. These are shared miracles of common organic elaboration in so many areas, just like our own children. The toddler, unsteadily clumping around living room, orienting to light, sound, mommy's voice, bathed in mommy, daddy, sister Sue's words, object recognition focused on attachment objects, face, tone, stimulating actions. He, she reaches out, brings to mouth, looks, moves. And we moderns begin to pattern word interactions so pointedly. Come, Jonesy, come to daddy. Peas, good, eat peas. No, don't hit mommy, hurts mommy, be gentle. We're entering a new area of investigation. We semi-consciously, but assiduously try and prepare the infant for the future word world. Fix labels in his brain, pattern our stimuli for him so that it will be better received. As the visual cerebral pathways mature, objects become recurrently recognizable, as they do for all primates. A recurring oral word form attaching to this recurrent object makes mommy. Abstraction makes mommy's mommy, grandma. And with constant adult kibitzing, Dolly can be mommy. And then this older other Dolly becomes daddy. The miraculous ability of a human child to differentiate and fix names and labels. Then quickly, action words and place words make their appearances, a cascading plethora of words. And the world dances at the first blubbered human utterance. It hooks him or her up to the freight train of simple one-word thoughts, declarations, namings. The name mama, one of the very first waveforms of oral cohesion, ineluctably attaches itself to the wave fronts of consistent visual cohesion. The miracle of patterned sound recognition, and soon enough, the first articulations. The lung, larynx, voice box, tongue, lips symphony beginning itself. Within weeks and months, beginning structure, grammar, syntax coalesce via constant interactive triggering, channeling, emphasizing. Millisecond timed brain patternings of genetically related modular interactivity begin to stick, as they have for eye, hand, mouth, sound, track, turn, suck, swallow, burp, and myriad automatic and autonomic reflexes form the rich underlying mammalian competence that is our mammalian primate simian heritage. Neurons jostle and compete to connect. Their very lives depend on it. And profoundly, but largely overlooked until recent, explosive new ideas have emerged, organic neural nets potentiate themselves. Patterns from the world recur and start to build up stable reactivities in the synapses that eventually will enable everything we experience and do. Talked to incessantly, talked around, just about whenever awake, now read to, sung to, reinforced lovingly, wheedled, cajoled truthfully, wonderfully, ferociously willed to speak. The previously mute one begins to mimic, babble, and squawk when spoken to, then finds overwhelming instrumental effectiveness in even this beginning of language. The little human. At 2, 3, and 4, language is implanted and starts to really take hold. Is implanted. This word implanted encodes much that we miss when we accept unexamined descriptions of what takes place here. Experimenters and philosophers presume much. Words and language are cultural implantations. As always, co-creations of brain ecological niches. Culture is a many thousand years in the making, clan-engineered environment. As above, our environments co-create us. Culture creates us to better and better parse, receive the signals the culture needs to be received. And because they are implanted pre-consciously for the toddler, with constant use in human environments, they, words, language, become completely automatic and feel as true as all the other perceptions the child learns. Once we gain automatons that function unconsciously, for example, much later, number automatons, adding, subtracting, etc., visual automatons, reading, adult visual tracking, processing complex screen experiences, etc. Very complex and multimodal automatons feel like inherent skills that were always in us. Picture and compare a higher mammal, a wolf cub, kitten, killer whale, or young chimpanzee. Many very sophisticated and high-level integrations achieved by animals are perfectly parallel to young Jonesy's achievements. The myriad and remarkably complexly integrated bodily geniuses of all our species, inside and out, homeostatic and perceptual and locomotive, are just a few, though wonderfully adaptive. He, our wonderful little Jonesy, then begins to think. What does it mean to think? Inner speech begins somewhat haphazardly at this time. I remind you that language is learned step by step by hearing through the oral system. Sounds associate with objects, persons, actions, and associated sounds then begin to repeat themselves in the toddler's mind. Inner speech is encoded irrevocably as heard words for the first few years. Inner speech is encoded as heard words for the first few years. Our illiterate written word culture tends to forget that the deep basis of all thought and thinking is inner speech. What this means is that the oft-repeated and heard in my head vocalizations become predictably attached to many stabilizing recognitions and percepts, and they in turn, heard spoken tokens, become perceptual discriminations in themselves. This will be elaborated in detail throughout. Names and categories, object permanencies, high-level and complex objectifications are summated as words in our mind space. The child starts making snippets of sentences almost as soon as she enters the language space. Ball, Jonesy, say ball. Much later, when the written word becomes predominant, we learn to recognize patterns of letters that speak the word and the words into our minds. The letters speak words. The visual gestalt speaks the word, which we hear as inner speech. Just like for the child learning language, the consistently reproduced and constantly presented phoneme syllables speak the word in our little Jonesy's mind. Slowly, words attach consistently to things the child's brain has begun to recognize consistently. Excuse me. First, at this very early level, the acoustic wave front must be discriminated and encoded. The regimentation of phonemes into morphemes, into syllables, into words, into meaningful sentences will one day lead to the word world. At this stage, it's fits and starts, to say the least. At first, at this beginning stage, it's dead slow, but eventually these sounds will project coherent analog tokens into our noggins in a vast and lightning quick integration of cerebral modules. Parts are linked, patterns form, and are practiced. Very simple categories create themselves through repetition. Then the words begin to speak themselves. 2-word sentences, then 3-word squawks. At this very early stage, simultaneously with quicker and more complex competent automatisms, increasing vocabulary, and somewhat primitive mimicking, the world is peopled. The world is peopled. The significant beings around the child accumulate gravitas, a complex inner complexity of repeating characteristics, along with a large series of concepts, associations, attributions, not only word related, conceptual, but touch, emotions, security, feelings, etc., which are spun around mommy and daddy and sister Sue as must happen. And the universe immediately becomes very personal. And we attach names and pronouns that sharply differentiate. In so many ways, language begins to construct the deep human personal pantheon of personhood. It's still very early, but the human need, genius, propensity to recognize another mind in the world slowly comes into being. This too must be implanted. In books we read to children, animals, even stick figures, cars, and fairies have inner lives. They talk and think, decide, feel emotion, do stuff, just like mommy, daddy, sister. From the earliest, we attribute inner coherence and analogous I-ness to many things, as if practicing for the later, larger world that is most literally peopled with attributed selves, which we learn are seduced into believing are just like our selves. The hardware is developing, conforming itself slowly but inexorably. The environment, mommy, daddy, is constantly rewarding speech of every kind, channeling and energizing this crucial and prototypical human behavior. The brain modules start to get more efficient, and they specialize, canalize, prioritize, and shuttle their patterns to other interested modules. Stories begin. At first, 2, 3, or 4 word snippets that help in the world. Jonesy, go potty. Not sleepy, mine. Then the little human is constantly being told the adult's descriptions and stories in higher, more complicated quanta. Then back and forth conversation begins to be possible. The cerebrum works to hold and integrate both experiential and talked utterances that have become the center of gravity of the child's existence. And even this early, his or her brain modules start to remember speech and words. A few common phrases speak themselves out of the child's mouth. And eventually, the child can recognize something from yesterday that was described. Memory is promised. By 3, 4, 5 years, the child being has been well initiated into a physical world that is perfectly analogous to the physical world of the wolf cub, kitty cat, and frisky puppy. And she or he is more and more skilled at physical and behavioral maneuverings in all its embedded complexity. Yet, perfectly stitched into this complexly integrated self, and now indeed dominating, driving, and for all intents and purposes subsuming the animal self, is the word self. The word self. The stream of consciousness, the personal word stream churning through my head. The child acquires this. It nests in the little being's brain. The crucial implantation, the crucial co-creation. The words accumulate, and at some magical instant, they begin to repeat themselves in Jonesy's little head by themselves, very imperfectly and clunkily at first, but inevitably. Language, the word stream, analogous to a stream in that it seems to be comprised of elements constantly in motion. It meanders all over the place, ceaselessly. Once launched, this constant stream chatter, categorizing, perceptual, conceptualizing, once initiated, it becomes what the individual being experiences as reality. The child starts to talk all day long, talks to himself, talks to his toys, dreams in image-word adventure amalgams. The environment, mommy, daddy, begins dictating the story self, anchored in the primordial body self, highlighting and commenting on the ever-changing visual aural fields. And correspondingly, pretty soon nearly everything in the child being's environment has a self behind the phenomenological mask, which is now clearly perceived and differentiated. In modern times, dolls, cartoons, puppets, every kind of television manifestation, even invisible beings, God, the devil, Tinkerbell, dear dead great-grandma, are all experienced as protagonists and purveyors of story reality, the background world against which everything takes place. Language becomes both an organ of perception and differentiator of perception itself. And it soon becomes the definer of reality, pleasure, value, and it very quickly becomes the key interactive energy. This is it. This is where they'll live for the rest of their lives. And they won't notice its discontinuities because the chunks, the gestalts, come together so seamlessly. And the Oz behind the curtain that creates it is invisible. Talked to just about constantly by family and now friends, abjured and guided by preschool teachers, then teachers, by priests and parsons, talking to his or herself just about constantly, learning and loving story after story, conversation after conversation, words being given and generated and absorbed continually, attaching together dynamically and hierarchically according to levels of abstraction that are embedded deeper and deeper into the child's language self. And they exist, these words, these concepts, these sentences that seem to happen out of the child's mouth. Where? Where do they exist? We will see. Follow the attention module. The wolf cub and chimp baby elaborate and maintain exquisite attention to their environments. The human child does this, but interlayered is the even more attracting and organizing attention of the word stream. We are unaware of how we are created in this way, partly because the means of being able to be aware are not yet created. If language is an organ of perception, an extended organ of perception, we'll study this in detail later. There can be no perception before the organ is self-synthesized, self-created. If we essentially high-level perceive through analogical categorization, we can never be aware of how we come to be before the automaton of analogical perception comes into being in us. Lower rung maps must be constructed first before higher, more abstract maps can even be imagined. An animal cannot understand abstractly that it walks through an environment without the power of abstraction, and neither can a child. And if the adults and even the culture doesn't see and understand how the child is being created, many of us will live more by intuitive stories than by accurate self-awareness. And I remind you that the young child, even though already a language genius, is empty of many things. It has little coherent knowledge of the adult variety, no sense of the scientific universe, outer space, solar system, planets, geography, no sense of library, literature, history, poetry, etc., no sense of what motivates anyone. How could it? Etc., etc. It lacks these. All these, too, must be implanted and kick-started and practiced. The child being begins empty of all that later makes it uniquely human existent. The idea that whole structures of knowledge, abstract, sociological, and personal, plus crucial autobiographical sequences, are implanted formally or by way of experience through word sharing, and that this process is what creates the I, the self, seems to be out of the experience of both science and folklore to me. Let's pause to examine and feel what the inner reality of human language experience is. The small child, the early human being, begins way back pre-consciously in the beginning, unskilled and unawares, empty of words, careening through its head. Word by word, sentence by sentence, fragment of story by fragment of story, then story by story, a stream emerges. Heard in his head, lines of chunked verbal code or thoughts come into being. Lines of chunked verbal code, coherently paired with things, actions, and eventually complex experiences. Lines of chunked verbal code heard from others. The clan implants culture. Jonesy hears Bobby's words. Bobby's words trigger words in his own mind, as if they were his. Other people's words appear in the listener's mental space. Bobby speaks, but Jonesy hears his own stored patterned words. They are triggered in his mind. My thoughts, words that pop up in my mind, are related to your thoughts. When you speak, I hear the words, the articulated word tokens, in my mind, in much the same way I hear my own thoughts in the theater of my own mind. Phrases, sentence fragments, whole sentences start to be heard in the child's mind, eventually are autonomously generated. Words, fragments of sentences, patterned verbal memes, standard verbal repertoires become embedded, operable, and operated on by the growing competent mind of the child. And words also encode feelings. Worries, that could hurt. Daddy will be mad. Plannings, go see Maria. Put it back, sit over here. Joys and hurts. These are high abstract renderings for a child of situations, dangers, and solutions, and all are inexorably induced to jumble through the human mind. For the child, the world is seen visually, just like for the young chimpanzee, and sound further parses the physical environment. But given time, the world is differentiated far more precisely and effectively verbally. And in time, the word sphere allows portable comparison of the recent past, plant breaks, mommy gets angry, and imminent future. Stove hot, ouchie. The word sphere creates the highest level interpretation of the lived perceptual space. The specifically human function of our minds are word processors. Our worlds are sense word worlds, and our worlds are built up in much the same manner as our visual and oral modalities, nested levels of quickly retrievable, concatenated abstractions. And these abstractions are exactly what have allowed us to flourish and dominate. Because we are both created by the standard outside world, culture, embedded and embedding neighborhoods and clan culture, and all of us are heirs to much the same neural substrates. And because we impose coherent, clan reproducible word symbols onto these patterns, we understand each other. We will see how all of modern reality, all reality, takes place in the created domain of word-language exchange. All is story. These ideas will be defended and much more elaborated all through this exposition. All selves, all my social experience, which is our truest creator, all selves, human learning, everything self feels or experiences is perceived, experienced within the word stream. Where else could it be? The complex blend of the perceptual stream, particularly visual oral, and the ever-bubbling personal word stream, plus the primordial body stream and the interwoven memory stream is exactly what I am, what myself is. No more, no less, unless the organism is damaged. How I was created by my environment is invisible to me. More precisely, unavailable to the in the process of being created self. Much later, at very much higher levels of abstraction, I can be made aware of and catch fleeting glimpses of the workings of my I, myself, that might enlighten me as to my true reality. Ray Jackendoff has myriad and varied insights into many domains, but his explication of language related to perception, categories, verbal tokening, etc., and consciousness is exceptionally important. Jackendoff has shown that what we can in truth be aware of is not meaning, not the web itself, but what he calls phenology. Words in our head. Words get into our heads via culture, mommy, daddy's utterances, are structured and put into motion by culture, and are what the culture does in the world. But we don't and cannot have access to the meaning behind the words. We hear them in our heads. Douglas Hofstadter and Emmanuel Sanders' remarkably wonderful book, Surfaces and Essences, Analogy as the Fuel and Fire of Thinking, adds depth and phenomenological complexity, helping us to comprehend the fabulously intricate process. The essential, massively concatenated nature of words and their inextricably bound relationships and their essentially instantaneous retrieval process, 20, 30, 40 millisecond correspondences found automatically, is brilliantly explicated and exampled in their work. And a profound and universally overlooked reality about thinking and intelligence is elucidated. Thinking is neither conscious, nor is it voluntary, nor is it transcendent, in the sense that it is somehow universal or cosmic or not dependent on being constructed by human communities. Thinking happens to me. When sufficiently trained, stimulated, the child begins to think. This means that he or she hears words in his or her mind that are congruent with the structures his or her community has implanted. Words I hear call up corresponding meaning structures that I experience as associated words going through my mind. Extraordinarily complicated relationships of analogical, metaphorical connectedness of words are unconsciously linked, anything but randomly, by my brain and manifest to me as a thought going through my mind related to a previous thought. I cannot consciously think of what I'm going to say before I say it. I cannot choose words, cobble together meanings, plan how my concepts will express my meaning. It happens in me. Analogously, I am not conscious of and don't create the physical data structures of sight or the physical data structures of sound or words. They happen to me. They appear to me. Science has begun to show some of the component mechanisms, correlates of perception and speech. The body seems to use to construct perception, but that has nothing to do with my own personal experience. This difficult to grog and hard to accept view of what happens in us will be seen many times in our explorations around human nature and the nature of intelligence. But words happen in me. Hearing something from you or seeing a sign with writing on it, an analogous situation, triggers the deeply structured meaning correspondences relating to what has stimulated my mind. And then I become conscious of hearing my own response as my understanding of what has been spoken to me. Whew. Again, I hear you speak. Then my mind knows, unconsciously, the neural mechanism parses what has been communicated, and it processes and fits together a response, and then utters that encoded response, encoded in words, that tells me what has been understood, tells me what I have understood. The two parts that enter consciousness are the hearing of what you speak to me. Encoded sound words trigger massive associative processing by the phonological word syntax meaning modules, and the hearing of what I think. Either hearing my own inner speech response, I think a response to what has been said, or hearing my response itself. I hear my response itself as I utter it back to you. Enlightens me concerning the continuation of what has been uttered. There are no homunculi here, though. The process happens as a whole. The words are heard and the response is produced seemingly immediately and heard. Then the next sentence appears. The process begins precognitively in the 2-3-year-old child and never ends for the individual. Whew, this is mad, isn't it? Brains talk and think and respond, and we hear what they say in our heads. It takes a lot to upend the standard theories and lived experiences supported by 2,000 years of philosophy and the natural assumptions of literature and community speech. It takes a lot to upend the standard theories. One last thought. As we'll see in the last chapter concerning neural nets, speaking about how neural connections, pathways, and nuclei and modules mediate world processing is a shorthand. An organic neural net, the brain itself doesn't elaborate concepts, words, or intermediate variables as its primary task, any more than simians need words to live their rich and wonderfully complicated lives. As an organic neural net, the brain reacts expertly to the world, to the impinging environment. Then it talks about it. We'll see this.